All right, welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, John Davidson, political editor at the Federalist. I'm joined today by Jarret Stepman. He's a columnist at the Daily Signal and author of the recent and very timely War on History, a book that came out in October of last year and that seemed to look forward to a lot of the things that we're seeing now play out in the streets. The war on history has sort of taken shape in the form of the destruction of statues, the defacement of public monuments, the burning of churches and public property, and all sorts of things that really bring home this idea that there is a war on history that is playing out in front of us. And we're pleased to have Jarret on the program today to talk about some of these things more broadly. Jarret, thanks for joining us, and thanks for coming on the program. How are you?
You're quite welcome, John. And as you said, it is very timely for what's going on in America and more broadly in the West right now.
I want to start with the book. It came out last fall, and this had been happening. This destruction of statues and early indications of a kind of war on history that the left more broadly was sort of taking aim at American history. Walk me through quickly sort of your thought process behind the book and what was maybe the inciting incident or inciting incidents that gave you the idea that this was a book that needed to be written. This was an argument that kind of needed to be fleshed out for what was happening and what was to come.
Yeah, I think it's something that needs to be fleshed out. I think for really, it's a rising generation. I wouldn't say there was any specific incident that made me think, yes, there's a great war in history. I think it's a combination of what we're seeing intellectually, certainly in higher education, and I think a lot of the elite institutions in this country. It's a combination of a millennial generation and now Gen Z coming behind that had a little bit different, I think, understanding of American history that was either, I think, in some sense, both ignorant of broader American history, but also to a certain extent indoctrinated to have a less clear view of what the country was all about, less clear view about the founding of this nation. And you combine that with, I think, an increasingly aggressive, hostile, now we use the term woke left, that you combine these things. I think you could even see, even a few years ago, that a kind of broader cultural revolution was coming, especially as the generations before that had a more, I think, a deeper kind of patriotism or rooted in an understanding of history, I think started to, age and get older. And we see, I think, that the broader societal trends in America, you could see these things coming. I mean, you could see the attacks on a variety of historical figures escalating over time. And I think especially now when you have this, I think, absolutist mentality toward the past, especially when we talk about the modern so-called anti-racist movement, where it's the racist versus the anti-racist. I think their kind of purist ideas about how people should be or how they should take these issues means that all kinds of figures from our past will simply be canceled because they didn't, check all the boxes. And I think that really has been escalating. What we've seen this summer is really a culmination of a broader attack on American history, on what the country really stands for. So I think it's something broader than any single individual statue or individual person. I don't think there's any one that really is the focus of this. I think it's an all of the above approach. And I think we're seeing that play out this summer for sure.
Yeah, I can tell you, for me, there was not an inciting incident, but there was a moment, I guess, where it occurred to me that there was a shift underway. And it really, I was kind of late to the game, I guess, because the shift's been underway for decades, especially in the schools, as you mentioned. Like, it's not just something in, sociology departments or soft social science departments in the universities. This has really been percolating through middle school and high school, and now, in sometimes at the elementary school level for many years, which is one reason I think why we're seeing it show up on the streets. There's this whole generation of kids who have marinated in a kind of anti-American history not just in college, but the college was just an extension of the kind of historical interpretation of the American story that they got from a very young age. But for me, I guess the inciting incident was a piece published in the New Republic in April of 2015 on the 150th anniversary of the surrender at Appomattox. And it was a piece that called for not just the destruction of Confederate monuments, which we had not seen on a large scale at that time, certainly not like we see now, but it called for the desecration and intentional neglect of Confederate graves in our national cemeteries. And I was surprised by this argument, not because I saw what was, not because I thought everything was fine, right, in our collective understanding of American history, but because I could understand an argument against having monuments in places of public prominence that honor Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee. That's at least something that we can argue about and have like a reasonable discussion. There's points on one side to make, for keeping the monuments. There's points on the other side to make for taking them down. And reasonable people can disagree, and they can disagree in good faith about this. But an argument for the intentional desecration of graves, of allowing Confederate graveyards to fall into disuse, to disinter the remains of the Confederate dead, to me was a whole new level of the war on history, so to speak. And it smacked of a kind of damnatio memoriae of the kind that you would see in ancient Rome, where the purpose of historical monuments or statues or even graves and memorials to war dead was entirely political. The purpose of it was to shore up the political power of the current regime or the current emperor. So you would see emperors defacing statues of the previous emperor. And this struck me as the motivation, the only possible motivation for an argument that we should defund national cemeteries that had Confederate veterans buried in them. And I wrote a piece for the Federalist at the time about that called Remembering Appomattox, where I took this argument to task. But then after that, the situation seemed to accelerate. Every couple months from then on, we began seeing calls from mayors and from governors. Of course, there was the whole thing about the Confederate flag in Charleston, South Carolina, after the Dillon Roof shooting that really triggered a lot of this. But it quickly moved beyond flags displayed on public property or on government property to monuments, and from monuments to graveyards. And now, as we've seen, from graveyards to churches, and from churches inevitably to neighborhoods and to people and to private residences. I want to get to something that you mentioned anti-racism. And this is a term that Ibram X Kendi, who's a professor and something of a darling on the woke left, has coined most recently in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he published an article at The Atlantic recently, last week, I believe. And he made this argument about how we're on the cusp of an anti-racism revolution made possible by Trump's overt racism. And he goes through an argument showing why Trump is a racist and why it's mobilized a critical mass of Americans to rise up against Trump and the racism that he represents. And he makes an interesting parallel, and I want to get your thoughts on. This is a long introduction to this, but he talks about the 1850s. And he talks about the 1850s as a time when Americans, a critical mass of Americans, became anti-slavery, and they rose up against the slave South because the slave South was pressing its claims for extending slavery into the territories and imposing Fugitive Slave Act policies on northern states. And he says, and I'll quote him briefly, he says, "The slaveholders' attempt to perpetuate their system backfired. In the years before the Civil War, the inhumanity and cruelty of enslavement became too blatant for Northerners to ignore or deny. Similarly, Trump's racism and that of his allies and enablers has been too blatant for Americans to ignore or deny. And just as the 1850s paved the way for the revolution against slavery, Trump's presidency has paved the way for a revolution against racism. What's interesting to me about this, there's a lot of interesting things to me about this passage, but one is that Kendi posits the slave power as the legitimate power, as the constitutional power against which Northerners waged a revolution, right? Which is, in some ways, the same premise that Confederate lost cause apologists took as their starting point, that the legitimate power was the slave power, and that anyone trying to write slavery out of the Constitution or limit slavery, limit the spread of slavery, was undermining the American founding, was stealing the property rights and trampling on the liberties of Southern Americans. So I just want to get your take on that. And I don't know if you read that essay by Kendi, but I'm interested to hear what you think about his frame for talking about this.
Yeah, I think a lot of these people actually, they do to a certain extent almost adopt the philosophy of Calhoun, Henry Hughes, George Fitzo, and a lot of the pro-slavery side of that time. Now, they would say, of course, that they are ferociously, anti-slavery and anti-racist, but they pick up on the philosophy of these characters to understand American history. It's really that interpretation that has won out over the interpretations of Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass. And I think to a certain extent, they also strip out the philosophy of Lincoln and Douglass as well. I think that's an important part of what the anti-racist movement is about. I mean, they're not about...
Spell it out for us, though, Jarret. What is the philosophy that they are positing over and against the philosophy of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass?
I mean, they do embrace a tribal collective identity. I mean, it's stripping out the idea of natural individual rights. It's stripping out the idea of equality before the law. I mean, Kendi has even said that he's for discrimination. He's for discrimination as long as it levels the inequities of history, essentially. So I think this idea, he's not borrowing on the philosophy that runs, I think, through the founders, through Lincoln, through Douglass, and through Martin Luther King Jr., this idea of making sure that Americans have equal treatment under the law. I think what Kendi and the other so-called anti-racists is something else. I think what they're saying is that your identity is essential to who you are. If you're white or you're black, that is essential to who you are and how you should think. And on top of that, any example of inequities between racial groups in society is an example of systematic racism that must be done away with through the law itself. You don't have individual rights under the Constitution. What you really have is a regime that needs to act punitively or embrace things like reparations to make sure that people are leveled, essentially. I mean, I think this is very different from the philosophy of, it's interesting that he channels the so-called anti-slavery movements of that time, but, obviously the chief champions and Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass are rarely ever mentioned, actually, in Kendi's works. I've read his book on how to be an anti-racist. Lincoln and Douglass are basically not even there. They don't really even show up. And it's very clear that their philosophy is very different. They've embraced this kind of idea. And look, it's very much in line with the 1619 Project, the idea that the United States is inherently wound around slavery and racism, that is the essence of what America is, rather than 1776. So I think this definitely flows through all of their ideas. I think that's why I think, them channeling the anti-slavery movements of the past or civil rights, I think is very much wrong. I mean, there's critical distinctions philosophically between them. I think Americans, to a large extent, were moving in the right direction on a lot of these issues. But the so-called anti-racists, they want the opposite. Their idea is that color blindness is racist, that laws that are not discriminatory are racist, because after all, you're allowing inequities to exist in society, and that is itself racist. That needs to be rectified through positive law. So it's interesting, again, it's interesting that they make their connection between themselves and the anti-slavery advocates and in American history, when I think really philosophically, they're more in line with the Calhounites than anybody else.
That's right. And this is something that you and I have both written about, that is very uncomfortable for the left to talk about, and they really react strongly when you try to point this out, the similarities between modern progressivism and the political philosophy of John C. Calhoun, who promulgated, starting in the 1830s, this idea of the concurrent majority, which is sort of an opaque term that simply meant the majority cannot do anything unless the minority agrees to it, and essentially the minority can nullify anything that the majority does. And this was, he was looking ahead. Obviously, he was a brilliant thinker, but he was looking ahead to a time in American history when the anti-slavery states, or the non-slaveholding states, would outnumber the slave states, and it was trying to shore up shore up slavery for the South and ensure that it would be permanent, which is very different, I think, than the idea of slavery that the founders had. Certainly from all the evidence that we have, and this goes to your point about the 1619 Project, Hannah Nicole Jones, infamously now, I guess, in her opening essay, introductory essay for the 1619 Project, said that the American Revolution was fought really to preserve slavery, when all of the evidence that we have indicates that the overwhelming movement in the United States, in the colonies, and at the time of the American Revolution, was to restrict slavery, was to limit slavery, was to abolish slavery, and also the slave trade. This is common not just in the states of New England, but elsewhere in the country as well. And I wonder, this goes back to that idea that, what was the legitimate power that was being rebelled against? What was the founding? Was in 1850, when you had this great upheaval in American politics, and the splintering of the parties into sectional parties. Were the abolitionists revolting against the legitimate power, or was it the South that was staging a kind of revolution of its own in trying to extend slavery and really, following the ideas of Calhoun, roll back what the original intention of the Constitution of the Declaration was, such that we had Abraham Lincoln, who almost had to refound the country during the war and return us to the founders' idea that slavery may have been a necessary evil at the founding, but they put it on a track to ultimate extinction. There's this tendency to talk about these cataclysmic moments in American history, like the 1850s, which was a prelude to an unimaginable bloodletting, an incredible violence. To talk about the 1850s and cite the 1850s the way Kendi does as this thing that we're on the cusp of now, and that we're in our 1850s moment, and there's almost this like longing for. It's very implicitly done, it's very cleverly done, but this nod toward these like moments of cataclysmic violence, as though that's something that we're anticipating and looking forward to, because once we're on the other side of that cataclysmic violence, we'll have this new era of justice and equality. Am I off base in thinking that is kind of where a lot of this rhetoric leads?
I think that's absolutely where it leads. I think that's why you see an escalation really of violence, not just toward statues, but toward human beings and property across society. I think what it's creating is this dynamic, especially as the so-called anti-racist talk about it. It's anti-racist versus racist. You can't simply just not be a racist. You have to be on our side, or you have to be on the other side. And of course, one stands for pure good, the other one for pure evil. I think it's very much setting up a situation where you have, two very different outlooks toward the world. You have one side being set up as saying, we cannot cooperate with these people. We cannot negotiate with these people. We simply have to that will also dig them up once they're dead and overturn their graves. I mean, that's where a lot of this rhetoric is going, as you talked about with the Confederate cemeteries and things like this. I mean, to a certain extent, it does set up how things were going in the United States in the 1850s, where, there was such a chasm, I think, in the way that people thought, Northerners, Southerners, the pro-slavery side, the anti-slavery side. I think moderates, were kind of fooling themselves during that era as far as where the country was going. I think the Calhounites kind of saw, clearly if slavery was going to be saved, this is the position that they had to take. They had to take the most radical and extreme. And Lincoln, I think, wisely saw where that was leading the country as well, and did what he could to save it while also saving the principles of 1776. Because even defeating that ideology doesn't mean that the country will actually come back together, that we'll have a constitution or freedom at the end of it, which I think makes it much wiser than the most radical of the abolitionists. Actually, I think Lincoln pursued a much better path of statesmanship, which, it's funny because a lot of the rhetoric, of course, now even around Lincoln and those who are anti-slavery, especially from those who are waging this war on history, even people like Lincoln are now coming into the crosshairs because they weren't quite pure enough. Even the idea of statesmanship in a diverse and divided society is something intolerable. You can only have the purest position. If you don't have that position, you have to be canceled. You have to be eliminated and liquidated. So I think that's why we're seeing also, part of this rhetoric and this movement, a lot of abolitionists or anti-slavery people, Jefferson included, and obviously Jefferson's sometimes a little more complicated, but even they are coming under fire too, because they're not pure enough under this dynamic. I mean, you really are simply, you're among the good or you're among the damned, and there's really no space in between those things. And when you do have a society that really is like that, it makes it incredibly difficult to compromise on anything. It makes it difficult to cooperate on laws that everybody sees as just and right. And so you set up a dynamic where you have two Americas. And I think we see ourselves moving into that position. And we have one side that's simply saying, if we're not going to get our way, we're going to break things. We're going to smash them, and we're going to silence you, literally or figuratively. And I think that's a very scary place to be in. And while I wouldn't say, yes, we're on the cusp of some grand civil war like we were in the 1850s, I think a lot of these ideas are very poisonous to the United States at this time. It's a country that's remarkably diverse. It's an incredibly large country, powerful, but it doesn't mean that can't be broken up. And I think, now I think failing to learn some of those lessons of the Civil War will be a mistake for us, because we certainly have a lot of enemies on the outside who would like to see the United States crack up. They'd like to see us divided by race, by ideology, and all these other things, especially in a world where we have a rising China that stands for everything that we don't stand for and we stand against. I think this is a very dangerous moment for America. Maybe the better comparison may be the 1960s and the turmoil that happened then. But absolutely, with the rhetoric and the ideology of those like Kendi and those closely aligned with him, they do lead to that point. If they're taken to their logical conclusion, that's a scary thing. Yeah.
And the thing about the 1850s is that there was also at the time, obviously, foreign powers who would like to see the United States divided and broken up. And we're very happy to see the outbreak of the Civil War. Circling back to the specific claims that Kendi made, he talks about this groundswell of anti-slavery in the 1850s. That's not quite accurate, right? So, Lincoln, for example, was not like an anti-slavery candidate. He wasn't, he didn't campaign on abolishing slavery. He didn't promise to abolish slavery. He campaigned for union and for keeping the union together, and made part of the reason, as you mentioned, that a lot of people denounce Lincoln in the same terms that they would denounce Jefferson or Jefferson Davis nowadays on the left, is because he wasn't anti-slavery enough. He wasn't an abolitionist. He made overtures to the South before the outbreak of the war to try to prevent disunion. And it wasn't just Lincoln, right? You had in the election of 1860, you had this culmination sort of the fragmenting of the American political parties, of the Whigs and the Democrats. You had Abraham Lincoln running as a Republican, relatively new political party made up of fragments of the Whigs and the Free Soilers and the Know Nothings. You had John Breckinridge, the Southern Democratic nominee who was nominated when the Democratic conventions that year just fell apart because they couldn't agree. The Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats couldn't agree on a candidate. You had the Northern Democratic candidate, Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's old foil, as the nominee for the Northern Democrats. And then you had John Bell, the Constitutional Union candidate, who was this weird party that was made up of fragments of the Whigs and some of these other parties that ended up not really having that big of a constituency. Nevertheless, the Constitutional Union Party in the election of 1860 got almost 13% of the vote. Stephen Douglas got almost 30% of the vote. The Southern Democrats in Breckinridge got 18% of the vote, and Abraham Lincoln got just less than 40% of the vote. So it's not as though there was this like consensus of anti-slavery, this groundswell of anti-slavery, the way Kendi describes. There was a fragmenting of our party system that produced a Republican president for the first time. But it's sort of a skewed view of history to talk about a groundswell of support for anti-slavery. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that who was rebelling against whom. It's not that the anti-slavery forces were rising up and rebelling against the legitimate incumbent slave power. It's really that the slave power was making claims based on Calhounist political philosophy that were antithetical to the Constitution and that envisioned this extension of slavery, not just west into the territories, but south into Mexico and into Cuba and into the Caribbean. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. You had mentioned the other day in a discussion the revolution, the slave revolt of 1804 in Haiti, and how that ended up being a very different kind of revolution than the Civil War in 1860. And I wonder if you could address two things that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. One is this movement among Southern slaveholding Democrats in the 1850s, this idea that slavery is not just going to be a thing for the South, but we're going to have a slave empire that extends to the Pacific and south of the Rio Grande. And then the experience of slavery in some of these places south of the Rio Grande, in the Caribbean particularly, and what their experience was with slavery.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point about the Southern Democrats, and I think very much the situation wasn't, as you said, this rise in anti-slavery, but this idea, especially for those in the free states, that the noose of slavery was tightening everywhere. That essentially, that because of the aggressive claims of the Southern slaveholders, the slaveocracy, as many called them, that essentially slavery was going to be brought to a town near you. I mean, a lot of these people said, I'm not particularly comfortable with slavery. I don't really care that much. That's something that goes on down there, but I don't want that here in my community. I don't want that here in my state. And I think that was an attitude that was prevalent very much throughout the North. I think when they saw the reality, and Lincoln very wisely added this to a lot of his speech and debates. In fact, he cited many of these, especially radicals like George Fitzhugh, who advocated that, well, slavery was so great, maybe we can apply that to the white underclass too. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Because slavery is such a benign institution. And of course, this horrified many of the constituents who had heard these arguments, I think, for the first time. I think what Lincoln was explaining in his philosophy is, how if you take the arguments of the slaveholders, the radical ones, to their logical conclusions, this is going to create a grand slaveholding society. This is going to be the end of freedom. It's not just going to be some people in a far off place that you don't really think about. It's going to be you too.
It was it was the extension of slavery they opposed. None of these people were talking about, or aside from the abolitionists, the ordinary folks in Illinois who Lincoln was speaking to, we're not contemplating, wresting the slaves from Southern slaveholders on their plantations, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, that was not at all what was their thought process on this. I mean, they were trying to simply prevent the extension of slavery. They were very much for free soil. They were bitter that, wealthy slaveholders would come to a territory near them, open up shop in their plantations. They would undermine free labor, which was a big thing, especially in a lot of the western states. So they were going to do everything they could to limit the furthering of slavery. But of course, given the logical conclusions of Calhoun and others, they believed, even before many in the North did, even before many of the anti-slavery side did, that America was not going to continue to be a house divided, that it was going to be a slave republic, or it was going to be one based, I think, on the ideals of the founding. I think when that became apparent to Americans, especially as the southern states did begin to secede and did eventually attack federal property at Fort Sumter, I think that is when you had this kind of rally around, we have to rally around the Union. The country itself is disintegrating. We're going to be, in a struggle for survival. I think it's once people realize that, I think that's when the deal had been sealed, so to speak. And of course, through the war itself, what did people eventually, especially, in the North, come to the conclusion that if we want to prevent this from happening again, we better end slavery, because that was the kindling for this whole problem. This whole division between, us and what is now become the Confederacy has been over this one issue. We better put a nail into this coffin once and for all, which Lincoln, I think, by his wise statesmanship, was ultimately able to do, because he was able to rally the country in the defense of the Union, not a crusade against slavery, but to simply defend the country as it was under the Constitution. And at the end of it, provoke Americans to see that, well, if we want to stop this from ever happening again, and we want to preserve our free republic, the institution of slavery must be done away with at this critical moment, which eventually did happen. That might not have been what, those like William Lloyd Garrison would have wanted, who advocated for burning the Constitution and not wanting to make any, deal with the devil, so to speak. Lincoln took the wiser course, the one of a statesman, to see that America was deeply divided on many issues. There were more issues than simply slavery in this country, but that ultimately slavery was an evil that had to be eradicated under a free country if we wanted to stick to the original vision of what this country was. And that ultimately did happen. It didn't necessarily go perfectly smoothly. There were a lot of rough days, especially in the era of Reconstruction. It's not as if the United States became, this country where, things like racism were eliminated, things like this. There were a lot of hard years afterward, and a lot of bitterness between the sides. Those are not things that you can just snap your fingers and make go away overnight. I think, people, looking back on history, wish that was the case, but things look a lot different from people who are actually observing this on the ground. We are very fortunate that we still have a country united under one constitution, given the issues that were at stake there, given the amount of bloodletting. Rarely does a civil war like that ever end up in a country becoming, in some ways, stronger, as the United States was in the 20th century, with slavery eliminated, with the country reunited, with the efforts to reintegrate Southerners back into the Union, the United States. You talk about, the American century, which I do in my book, was very much set up by that. It became possible because of those efforts. Truly remarkable.
Right, to try to reintegrate a section of the country that had revolted, a population that had revolted. And essentially, you mentioned this just a second ago, the radical abolitionists, what Kendi might have called the groundswell of anti-slavery in the North. These abolitionists didn't have any great love for Lincoln, because he wasn't an abolitionist, and they didn't have any great love for the Constitution. And in that, they sort of came around in a way to having something in common with the Calhounites and the fire breathers of the South, who also didn't have any great love for the Constitution. The radical abolitionists said, well, if the Constitution, protects slavery because it protects property, then damn the Constitution, and I think it's important to understand that as you say, what Lincoln was doing was a kind of refounding of the country, bringing the country back, forcing the pro-slavery sections of the country and forcing the abolitionist sections of the country to come back to the Constitution and re-ground the country in the constitutional principles of equality under the law, due process, liberty, that the idea that a man is entitled to the fruit of his labor, right? So that slavery can never obtain in a constitutional republic because it denies people the fruit of their own labor. So it wasn't that it wasn't that the anti-slavery elements in the North were super committed to the Constitution. They were willing to throw the Constitution away if it meant getting rid of slavery. And I think that's maybe a bit of a too nuanced of a distinction for the kinds of discussions that we commonly have today about the Civil War, which are really binary and black and white, traitors versus patriots. There were, by any definition, some traitorous people in the North who would gladly break up the Union and burn the Constitution if it meant getting rid of slavery.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and I think that's the genius of Lincoln's statesmanship, understanding that yes, you could free some people, but it doesn't necessarily Americans as a whole are going to be free at the end of this. The United States without the Constitution, without what was built in 1776, might have been a very ugly thing, even with the abolition of slavery. And I think that kind of leads to your second question about the Haitian Revolution. I think not very well understood in this country, not very well known. I think there is a very interesting comparison here because Haiti, which was the second kind of colony that broke off in the New World, to a certain extent actually has the elements of what especially Jamil Bouli, I believe, columnist, New York Times, talked about how white soldiers didn't do anything in the American Civil War, that there was slavery was fought simply by blacks in America, which is not true. It was by both. But in Haiti, you actually did have a slave revolt that took place in 1804. Before 1804, a slave revolt essentially overthrew the slaveocracy, created an independent sort of quasi-republic, although I don't think it necessarily even is defined as a republic. There, George Washington, Toussaint Louverture, who was a black man who had actually been a slave at one point, had won his freedom, had purchased slaves, black slaves, then became, this great hero of emancipation, made himself dictator for life with the ability to appoint his successor. So a very different path from George Washington. He was quickly deposed in Haiti. His lieutenant, this man named Dessalines, ultimately rise to power and realize, what the problem is that, this is a white and black society. We need to simply eliminate the other side of this equation. And so 1804 commit one of the first true genocides, I think, in the Western world, killing basically all the white people who lived. And you could say, an example of, the most ruthless kind of social justice. After all, these white slavers, aren't they, they're horrible people. They're keeping people, in chains. They need to be destroyed, and they were. And that, to a certain extent, that genocide set up the future of Haiti, because when they killed all those people, men, women, and children, when they stripped whites on the island of all property rights, they made it impossible to do business with other countries, because after all, if you step on their shores and you're the wrong skin color, you could be just immediately murdered. Set up a long-term, I think, set of ideas where the rule of law, private property, even the defense of the rights of life are simply not respected whatsoever. You have a system where you have the kind of most ruthless kind of racial justice, you could call it, didn't actually lead to any kind of prosperity. At the time of Haiti's creation, it was wealthier than the American colonies. John Adams, wrote letters saying that he was worried about the Haitian military. The idea in 2020 that the United States would be worried about the Haitian military is almost, it's a total joke. They really don't even have a military, or dependent on enormous amount of foreign aid. Things didn't have to be that way. There were seeds for something better in Haiti, because they pursued a course, I think, of ruthlessness, of destruction, they didn't have a constitutional system like the United States. They pursued a course much more closely aligned with the French Revolution, a social and cultural revolution where their enemies were punished and they were destroyed and in many cases outright murdered. So they go through a series of dictators. I mean, Haiti has become almost a, picture perfect example of, people call it, banana republic or whatever it is. That things didn't have to happen that way,
right.
But they did because they pursued those positions, because they pursued the ruthlessness that felt very much, I'm sure, like justice, but ultimately did not create a system that would have liberty, would have the rule of law, would have all these things that are absolutely essential in the American DNA to our success. It's because we pursued a different path where we, through the law, have eliminated many of the bad things about this country that existed in America at the time of its creation, that we pursued to a certain extent a slower, I think, more reasonable path to change in this country, that we preserved our constitutional system, that we preserved freedom for all, and not just, freedom for one side or the other. And I think that, you can see again in the histories of these two countries, I think it's an important lesson for those who want some kind of ruthless racial justice as they see it today. That doesn't mean that we're going to be a country that's better for anybody. Because after all, in a place like Haiti, no matter, what your skin color is, no matter what your background is, things aren't going so well.
Yeah.
And here we've pursued a very different course. And I think that's an important lesson.
Yeah. It doesn't mean that we're even going to be a country necessarily. The what lies on the other side of the terror and the executions isn't necessarily a republic, and it isn't necessarily one people under the Constitution. I'm struck every time these writers like Kendi or like Jamel Bowie or Ta-Nehisi Coates, if you talk to them long enough in some of these longer interviews and podcasts they've done, they always, and I mentioned this earlier, they always kind of rhetorically end up circling around the French Revolution or the cataclysm of the Civil War as something that is to be desired, right? As something that is a reckoning that we need to look forward to. And I pulled this up earlier, and this is something that I've referenced before and others have referenced before. An interview that Ta-Nehisi Coates did with Ezra Klein a few years ago, I believe it was in 2017. At the end of the interview, Klein mentions to him the French Revolution because Coates's vision for racial reconciliation, I think, is so dismal, is so pessimistic. Klein kind of floats this question out there, and this is what Coates says. He says, "It's very easy for me to see myself being contemporary with processes that might make for an equal world, more equality, and maybe the complete abolition of race as a construct, and being horrified by the process, maybe even attacking the process. I think these things don't tend to happen peacefully." And he's responding there to a question about whether we need something like the French Revolution to bring about racial justice in America. And of course, these people never come out and say, yes, we need the guillotine, although Antifa likes to bring out guillotines every once in a while as props for their rallies, right? But it always strikes me that this is the rhetoric that they incline toward, even when they're kind of like Coates was there, kind of apologizing for it. They seem to think that a great cataclysmic revolutionary reckoning is what we need to bring about justice in this country. And I think the only explanation for that is what we've kind of been saying all along, which is that they don't believe that the constitutional system of our founding is legitimate, that it needs to be overthrown, that we need to have a revolution against it. And until we have a revolution against it, maybe a violent revolution, who knows, right? Maybe, that we'll never have justice and we'll never have equality. And that the lie that has been the American system and the American Republic will persist. And the crime that is American society and the plunder and the exploitation will continue until we have this reckoning. You know, I don't want to close on that, but I will ask you in sort of closing, given what we're seeing in the streets right now and the rhetoric that we're seeing associated with it, and the sort of absolutism that we see in something like the Black Lives Matter movement, or the anti-racist kind of woke rhetoric that we're seeing. Having written a book like War on History last year, and given everything that's happened since the book came out and since you wrote it, where do you see this going? And what can we expect, you know, not just looking ahead to the election in November, but looking ahead to the next couple of years? And I know that it's hard to predict what will happen in American society in the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of really great social upheaval. But where do you see us in the war on history, and where do you see us on a lot of these issues with our history in the next year and in the coming years?
Yeah, I think, you know, after a lot of these, I would say, radicals have pushed things to the brink, I think, you know, we are seeing that spill over. I mean, it's amazing. You know, over the summer, you know, I wrote about the war in history, how, you know, it wasn't just Confederates that the Union heroes would come down to. And it was like all at once this summer that started to happen. I mean, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, all these things. And I to a certain extent, while, you know, a lot of my focus is in preserving in American history the ideas of what this country is all about, you know, I think this movement is growing to something much bigger and to a certain extent more dangerous, because it's not just going to be the statues that are under attack. I mean, a lot of the hatred toward, I think, the statues is really toward also hatred toward fellow American citizens and what this country stands for. And to a large extent, you know, this so-called anti-racist movement is very much works in opposite direction, I think, of the appeals of the civil rights movement that succeeded in the 1960s, where this idea that, you know, Americans, you're not living up to 1776, you're not living up to your founding principles. We need to extend these ideas to all people in this country. You know, this movement really is working in the opposite direction of that. It's saying all those ideas, those principles, they were wrong to begin with. In fact, that is leading to more racism, to more oppression. You know, this idea of, you know, color blindness is racism. I think they really believe that. I think if you do not embrace your identity, you are essentially furthering racism. And to a certain extent, I now see that escalating in avalanche. I mean, look, I mean, we now have these ideas that are now in corporate boardrooms. They're now being preached to government agencies. We now see the American media, which I think has been beating the drum for these things for years. And I think to a certain extent, there's just the simple, this will gain us political power. I think obviously the Democrat Party has been very successful in using these issues to gain power. But, you know, once you start these kinds of like broader cultural revolutions, it's not always possible to put the genie back in the bottle. In fact, I'm very much guessing that it won't be, that regardless of what happens in November, these things are really going to start to escalate. I think there are a lot of Americans right now, especially when we have these lockdowns, coronavirus, who are very worried about the future of the country. They've seen what's happened this summer. They've been worried about the level of leadership in this country. You know, who's out there saying that these people are wrong, that these mobs are terrible, that our history is something that, you know, while imperfect, needs to be protected. You know, Americans, I think that to a certain extent this summer, the mob has been winning. The question will be, what will the reaction be from, you know, the American people at large? I mean, is this really what the majority of the American people really want? Do they want to burn our history? Do they want to silence anybody who stands against them? Or do they want to preserve some semblance of what the American Republic was founded on? I think that's the big challenge. I think right now, I think the majority still does stand for 1776. I think that is the majority in this country. But if there aren't the people there willing to say something and be brave and stand for that and say, you know what, I'm willing to defend this country. I don't accept your premise that America is inherently racist country and that 1776 was nothing but a sham. If you don't have people who are willing to stand up, especially in places of power where they do have strength and power, and stand up to that mob at this moment, we're just going to see more mob violence. I mean, it'll simply encourage them to take more aggressive actions to cancel anybody they disagree with, to make sure that, and you know, it won't just be limited to America's big cities. You know, they want to come to a town near you and tell you how things are, and you're going to listen, or else. They no longer have a conception of, you know, limitation on power, limitation on government. You're with us or against us. We'll obliterate you if you don't agree. And that's a scary thing.
Yeah. And why wouldn't they? I mean, they have sort of proven to themselves and to the rest of us that they don't need a majority to advance their agenda in a lot of ways. They need the institutions, and they have the crucial ones, as we've seen. It's not an incredibly optimistic note to end on, but we don't live in incredibly optimistic times, so we'll have to leave it there. Jarret, thanks for joining us today on the Federalist Radio Hour. I appreciate your perspective. We'll have to talk about this again soon. There's, of course, a lot more to cover. You can follow Jarret on Twitter at Jarret Stepman. He is a columnist at the Daily Signal and author of The War on History, an excellent book that goes into a lot of what we've been discussing here in great detail. Check it out. You won't regret it. I'm John Davidson, political editor at The Federalist. Until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.